This presentation investigates three measures of lexical difference between speeches made by Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. When I talk about lexical difference, I'm referring to differences in the sorts of words used. I was looking for measures which are easy to quantify and calculate, reliable when measured for different speeches made by the same person, and relatively independent of speech topic. Basically, I was looking for broad, general measures where I could feasibly get a result of no difference. The first two measures I looked at were letter frequency and word length. Now, the point that I was making last slide was that I wanted something where it would be entirely feasible for, say, Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott to use words of approximately the same length on average, or for them to use, say, the letter E with approximately the same frequency. So I wanted the hypothesis of no difference to quite possibly be a valid one. Intuitively, we could say, well, yeah, it's possible that there is actually no difference between the two on either of these measures. The third measure I looked at was Yule's K, which is a measure of lexical repetition. Lexical repetition is basically the tendency of a writer or speaker to repeat themselves, that is to say, to use the same words, to repeat the same words over and over and over again. It's a very difficult concept to measure because as the length of a speech increases, then the amount of new words available to you to choose decreases because there's only a finite number of words in your vocabulary. So we tend to find that as the length of a speech increases, the amount of lexical repetition also increases. On the other hand, it's also a very useful concept because it tends to be related to a lot of interesting things, such as perceived subjective quality of the writing or speech, and also the language proficiency of the speaker or writer. When it came to data collection, my aim was to try and obtain as large a data set as possible. I basically wanted to see what was out there and take all of it. Now, Tony Abbott's website, was very helpful in this regard since it contains a list of pretty much every speech that he's made since the turn of the millennium. However, I was unable to find a similar resource for Julia Gillard. The closest I could come up with was the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations website, which contained a number of speeches made by Gillard. So whether these two datasets are comparable is a bit of an open question. Tony Abbott's set contains lots of speeches from when he was in government, when he was in opposition, when he's the leader of opposition, and that same sort of variety is probably lacking a little bit in the Gillard dataset. I used a Python script to download all the speeches I could find on both of the two websites listed on the previous slides. And then there were a variety of technical things I did to get that data from the web onto my computer in a relatively clean form. However, once it was there, I didn't try anything too fancy in terms of processing the data. There's a lot of things that a natural language processing guru would do, such as removing excess grammatical words and converting, for example, different forms of a verb, such as speak and speaking, to the same root stem speak. Anyway, I didn't do any of that. I didn't even remove names. And that has some interesting consequences. The longest word I found in Abbott's speeches was actually PricewaterhouseCoopers. But my hope is that overall, given the size of the dataset, I will still get a reasonably good impression in general of how Abbott and Gillard use words differently. For the first two measures of lexical difference, that is, letter frequency and word length, I basically counted the letters and words in every document and added them up across the whole set of documents. The letter frequency was then analyzed using the chi-square test for independence, and word length was analyzed using a independent samples t-test. Now, I call it a t-test, but really we're talking about 300,000 words per sample, so a t-test with 600,000 odd degrees of freedom is effectively a z-test. I'm preferring to use the term t-test here because the underlying population isn't normal. We don't know the standard deviation, but yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. Now, Yule's K needed to be handled a little bit differently. As I mentioned earlier, it can be measures of lexical repetition can at times be somewhat sensitive to changes in the length of the document. Now, McCarthy and Jarvis in their paper do a fairly in-depth analysis of Yule's K and a whole number of other measures of lexical repetition. Their emphasis is actually on one called D. But anyway, my point is that they give a range of word counts for which we expect Yule's K to be relatively stable, that is to say, independent of the length of the speech. So that's why I only used speeches in the 400 to 2000 word range. Now, for each of these speeches in that range, I calculated the Yule's K, and that gave us two samples of about 50 speeches each, which I could use to conduct a Mann-Whitney test on. Now, the choice of Mann-Whitney was owing to the fact that the samples were a little on the small side and demonstrably non-normal. Let's take a look at some results then. Here we have a table of the observed letter frequencies from which I calculated my chi-squared statistic for the test for independence. And here's the result of that test of independence. We have an extremely large chi-squared value. It's absolutely significant. We have every reason to reject the hypothesis that the frequency with which a letter appears in a speech is independent of who is making the speech, Abbott or Gillard. To put it another way, it seems that Gillard is more likely to use some letters and Abbott is more likely to use others. Moving on to our second measure of lexical difference, we have word length. And here you can see what that distribution looks like for Abbott. You'll see that we get a very similar result for Gillard. And neither of these distributions looks particularly normal. They're both very heavily positively skewed. In this case, that really doesn't matter because the sample size is just absolutely so large that we're more than justified in applying the central limit theorem. And yeah, as you can see, we end up with a fairly significant t-value, and yeah, the 99.9% confidence interval for the difference is somewhere between 14% and 19% of a letter. So I would say that there is a difference. It appears that Gillard uses slightly longer words, and it's significant. Finally, we'll take a look at Yule's K. Here are the descriptive statistics for Abbott. We have a histogram and then a probability plot, and yeah, it's pretty clear that the hypothesis of normality should be rejected. That is to say, we have some fairly compelling evidence here that says that Yule's K for Abbott is not normally distributed. Here we can see that the results for Gillard are quite similar. Now, one of the reasons why I'm making such a big deal out of this non-normality here when I didn't before is because the sample sizes here are much smaller. We're dealing with like 50 samples each for Abbott and Gillard. And well, you know, that might be enough to justify invoking the central limit theorem and saying, well, 50 samples, you know, it's the sample distribution would be normal. Yeah, I've just felt inclined to lean on the safe side and go with a non-parametric test, because what's the worst that could happen? You lose a little bit of power, but as you'll see in the next slide, we end up finding a significant difference anyway. As you can see here, we have a nice significant Mann-Whitney test statistic. It seems that Gillard scores a bit higher on this measure of repetition. And just a note here about the point estimate of the difference. It's not just subtracting the medians, as I'd originally supposed, but it's actually a measure of the median of all possible pairwise differences between the two samples. All in all, it seems that Gillard scored higher on the measures of repetition and also the measure of word length. So that would suggest that in this particular sample of speeches, she has used a less diverse vocabulary than Abbott used in his sample of speeches, and also that her words have tended to be, on the whole, a little bit longer on average than the words that Abbott uses. Now, I have to admit that there is a potential for confounding effects here. As I mentioned before, that the samples aren't necessarily 100% comparable, and I have this suspicion that the Gillard sample might contain more speeches to Parliament and that sort of thing, which could perhaps result in the use of longer words and repeating oneself more. Oh, and a final note, obviously there was also the significant difference in the letter frequency of both Gillard and Abbott, which I guess is kind of interesting to note.